Welcome back to the Midlife Transit series. This is the 7th video in the series, which is quite serendipitous, as you'll learn when I'm talking about the cycles of 7 later in this video. We finally arrive at the Chiron return, which is the climax of the midlife transition. But first, I want to say thank you to all of those who signed up for my newsletter. I will be launching that as soon as I'm done with the series. I have one more video planned to wrap up the series. I also want to announce that I'm running a solar return special for new clients. I'll include a link below with more information in case you're interested. Also, any love that you can give these videos is really helpful, and I thank you for your support. Okay, without further ado, let's talk about Chiron, the planet. Originally discovered in 1977 and classified as an asteroid, mini-planet Chiron was the first identified member of a new class of objects in our solar system. Chiron's position and size and behavior were unusual. It has a detectable coma indicating that it is a cometary body, but it is over 50,000 times the characteristic volume of a comet, a size more commensurate with a large asteroid, which it was initially assumed to be. It was too small to be a planet. Perplexed, astronomers initially coined the term planetoid, meaning planet-like, to classify Chiron, as the word planet is derived from the Greek for wanderer. Astronomically, Chiron wanders along an elliptical orbit steeply inclined to the ecliptic. Indeed, the image of an eccentric, the wanderer, outsider, loner, or maverick was quickly noticed as relevant to its astrological meaning. Chiron is indeed the wanderer among wanderers. These bodies have been designated centaurs after the race of half-man, half-horse beings from Greek mythology, in recognition of their dual comet asteroid nature. It is believed that the centaurs may be objects which have escaped from the Kuiper Belt, a hypothetical disk of objects orbiting beyond Neptune. So this is the Kuiper Belt you can see here. Over the past 50 years or so, Chiron has continued to stand out from the rest of the centaurs, being one of the biggest centaurs in size. A graphic of centaur orbits resembles an elegantly chaotic and multidimensional spider web surrounding the sun. They thread to and fro like celestial shuttles, weaving their filigrees of consciousness in the dark skies between Jupiter and Pluto. This poignantly reflects their function within the horoscope. They act as agents of integration for the energies of the outer planets. So here is that image of all the centaurs and their eccentric orbits that happen around the sun. All the other planets have more kind of regular orbits, except for Pluto here. So that is really interesting to think about their eccentricity. Chiron, for the most part, orbits in the solar system between Saturn and Uranus. It acts as a bridge between the serious, restricting personal energy of Saturn and the revolutionary, liberating collective spirit of Uranus. You see Chiron here. It sits between Saturn and Uranus. And in this picture, you can see the eccentric orbit of Chiron a little bit better. It's this white orbit here. And it does go inside Saturn for a bit, in between Saturn and Jupiter, but it mostly stays outside of the orbit of Saturn, almost to Uranus, but it doesn't move outside of Uranus's orbit. Okay, so let's talk about that 7-year cycle I teased at the beginning. From the Uranus opposition to the Chiron return, it takes 7 years, or a quarter of a Saturn cycle, which I thought was interesting. Many spiritual traditions speak to the number 7, and the Saturn cycle is most likely connected to this. Some say it's a marker of human development. Saturn's cycle is connected to the moon cycle. Think about the moon's influence on us individually and collectively. It represents our daily rhythm, our body. We are highly influenced by its gravitational pull and its phases. There would be no life on Earth without the moon. The moon takes 2.5 days to move through an astrological sign, and Saturn takes 2.5 years. We mark the Saturn cycle in 7-year segments. There is the opening Saturn square at 7 years old, the opposition to itself at 14, the closing square at 21 years, which coincidentally includes the opening Uranus square, and finally the Saturn return. Then the cycle starts over. The second Saturn opposition in midlife is timed to be around the Uranus opposition, which I talked about in my Saturn and Uranus videos if you watch them. The Chiron return happens between the ages of 49 and 50. And this is the 7th cycle of 7 years, which is no coincidence. It's this crucial marker in our developmental cycle. And what happens between the Uranus opposition and the Chiron return will define our next 50 years. God willing, we live that long. Okay, so let's move on to the mythology. Okay, the mythology. I sourced this mythology from Melanie Reinhardt's excellent book about Chiron. She was the first person to publish a book about Chiron, and it's jam-packed with great information, so I encourage you to check that out. Kronos, or who we refer to as Saturn, first met Philyra in Thessaly while searching for his baby son Zeus, whom his wife Rhea had concealed, being wary of Kronos repeatedly devouring their offspring. Philyra changed herself into a mare to try and escape Kronos, who was ardently pursuing her. However, Kronos in turn deceived her by changing himself into a horse and succeeded thus in mating with her. Eventually, a child of this union was born to Philyra. He was Chiron the centaur, with the body and legs of a horse and the torso and arms of a man. When Philyra saw him, she was horrified and pleaded to be changed into anything other than what she was, the mother of a monster. The gods duly obliged by turning her into a linden tree. Thus Chiron was abandoned, but later found by a shepherd and taken to Apollo, who became his foster father. Thus, although Chiron survives, he is exiled from his origins and has received his first wound, rejection by his mother. An interesting point emerges at this stage. In the Greek story of creation, Chiron's birth is unique. He is the product of the first union that is not directly incestuous. All ancestors on his father's side were conceived by unions of mother and son or sister and brother pairs. Philyra was the niece of Kronos, but of a different species. She was a nymph. Therefore, they are still related, but distantly. Chiron breaks free from the original matrix, and individuality is asserted through a process of rupture and exile, an initiation. Sounds like the midlife transits. In the story of Chiron, we see both the painful repercussions of this and also the resolution. Apollo, the sun god, much revered by the Greeks, was Chiron's foster father and teacher. As the god of music, divination, and prophecy, poetry, and healing, Apollo was a noble paragon of youth, beauty, wisdom, and justice. He purified men of their guilt and transgressions, offering divine protection against wild animals and disease. Apollo was the brother of Artemis, who presided over the animal kingdom, wild places, and women's rites of passage, also imparting sacred knowledge of healing properties of plants. Under the tutelage of Apollo, Chiron became a wise man, a prophet, physician, teacher, and musician. Local kings would send their sons to him for education in the leadership skills appropriate for their future roles. He taught everything from writing, archery, hunting, the art of war, and medicine, all survival skills, to ethics, music, religious rituals, and the beginnings of natural science. There are numerous accounts of healings and divinations performed by Chiron. The anecdote that earned Chiron the title Wounded Healer is central to his story, and several different renditions exist. In one such, Hercules was visiting the cave of the centaur Pholus, who opened the famous jar of wine for his illustrious and insistent guest. When the wild centaurs outside smelled the wine, they began to stampede, and in the fracas that ensued, one of Hercules' arrows struck Chiron in the leg. Being a demigod, Chiron could not die, and neither could he find a way to heal his wound, which accompanied him for the remainder of his long life, although his suffering did resolve. Note that Chiron's wound is not his fault. Note also, it is Chiron's animal half that is wounded, highlighting the vulnerability of our bodily existence. This wounding can be seen to parallel how we earthlings have wounded our own sacred earth ground with the Herculean endeavor to satisfy our collective greed and acquisitiveness. The result is that our survival as a species is no longer assured. It's interesting to note that this book was published in 1989 when Chiron was in Cancer. It's very much attuned to the lunar energies, as you see, the vulnerabilities of our body and our environment, which we are dealing with in a more serious way right now. So it's interesting to reflect on, especially as, the US is experiencing its Chiron return, just as I am, and we're going through some serious pain points in relation to that. Okay, so I'm going to turn to an excerpt that I found on astro.com written by Liz Green about Chiron. In myth, Chiron did not become a healer because he was wounded. This reinterpretation of the myth is valid as a way of working with one's own wounds, but Chiron's pain serves no such noble purpose in the story. He is already a teacher and a healer before he is wounded. It could be assumed that he is already wounded because he suffers isolation, although he is a centaur, and therefore one of a tribe of creatures who symbolizes natural instinctual powers. He is himself civilized and has thus separated himself from his tribe. Chiron in this context represents the wise animal, a natural power which of its own volition has chosen to serve human evolution and consciousness, rather than remain blindly subject to the instinctual compulsions of the animal kingdom. Like the helpful animal in fairy tales, Chiron turns his back on the savagery of his instinctual nature in order to serve the evolutionary pattern which he deems to be the way forward for the whole of life. But Chiron is in the wrong place at the wrong time. He is caught between Heracles, the solar hero who personifies the strength of the human ego, and the wild, untamed centaurs whom Chiron himself has left behind. While the battle rages, Chiron takes no part. He has sympathy for both. Perhaps because of this mediating role, which deprives him of his natural aggression, he is accidentally wounded by a poisoned arrow aimed at another centaur. And the wound does not heal, no matter what healing methods he applies to it. Ultimately, he retires to his cave, howling in anguish, begging for death. Zeus and Prometheus take pity on him and grant him the boon of mortality, allowing him to die in peace like any mortal, although once he was God. This terrible story implies a state of unfairness in life, which is hard for any individual and perhaps even harder for the idealistic individual involved in studies such as astrology to countenance. We want to believe that life is fair and that goodness is rewarded and evil punished, at least in some other incarnation, if not in this one. Here is a good creature who suffers through no fault of his own, a victim of the inevitable battle between evolution, inertia, consciousness, and blind instinctuality. Chiron is an image of that in us, which has been wounded unfairly by life and by inescapable conditions, which reflect failings and flaws in a collective psyche, which is unfailingly clumsy in its efforts to progress. Now, this description really cuts to the core of what my Chiron return journey has felt like this year, as it relates to this election specifically. You see, as I mentioned before, I share a Chiron return with the US. I was born during the US's Chiron return. I'll review this in more detail as we talk about my personal experience in a moment. But first, I want to share some quotes, again, by Melanie Reinhardt, centered around the shamanic symbolism of the Chiron return. Okay, from Melanie Reinhardt's information about the shamanic journey and how it relates to the Chiron return. Although the details of shamanic practices vary from one culture to another, there's an underlying consistency of meaning which is relevant to understanding Chiron. In his book, Up from Eden, Ken Wilber describes as typhonic any figure represented as half animal and half human. He also uses this word to describe the mode of consciousness that prevailed from about 200,000 to 50,000 years ago. The mythic image of Chiron resonates with this ancient mode of consciousness and provides a clue to its astrological meaning in the horoscope. It suggests the reemergence of an ancient world view that lies dormant in the substrata of the individual psyche, one that we are called upon to re-embrace, refine, and reintegrate. Historically, then, the shamanic period is characterized by a sense of self embedded in the totality comprising family, ancestors, the world of nature, including the animal kingdom, and indeed the whole of life, as well as various cosmological deities and beings inhabiting other planes of existence. Here, individuality is not an isolated phenomenon, but it has its existence and value in relation to the community, personal and transpersonal. It is precisely the lack of these multivalent connections that is the soul sickness of our industrialized Western society, which has resulted in the proliferation of illness, mental and physical. Jung expresses this poignantly. As scientific understanding has grown, so our world has become dehumanized. Men feel himself isolated in the cosmos because he is no longer involved in nature and has lost his emotional unconscious identity with natural phenomenon. These have slowly lost their symbolic implications. Thunder is no longer the voice of an angry god, nor is lightning his avenging missile. No river contains a spirit. No tree is the embodiment of wisdom. No mountain cave the home of a great demon. No voices now speak to man from stones, plants, and animals, nor does he speak to them believing they can hear. His contact with nature is gone, and with it has gone the profound emotional energy that this symbolic connection supplied. Heaven and hell coexist within our own consciousness and are not in the future. Rather, they exist in the multidimensional present. How we relate to our own life experience contributes directly to whether we experience heaven or hell right here. In the typical shamanic view, the world is divided into three realms. We live our earthly life in the middle realm, the only one bound by laws of linear time and three-dimensional space. Above rest the celestial realms, while the infernal realms lie below. Relating this to our astrological model, we can see the visible planets up to and including Saturn as primarily concerned with the middle realm. Uranus and Neptune signify the celestial realms, while Pluto, Chiron, and the Centaurs connect us with the infernal realms. The parallel in terms of consciousness is this. Before we have begun to experience ourselves as separate individuals, our primary mode of consciousness is typhonic, as previously described. In the magical universe of which we are the center, inner and outer are merged, emotions and sensations from a seamless web where vulnerability alternates with the sense of omnipotence. A baby still experiences life in its full archetypal intensity, peopled with primordial gods and demons, the imaginal counterparts of the real world. Here, the term typhonic will additionally be used to refer to the mode of consciousness prevailing during the period from conception through gestation and birth until about age 3. Typhonic consciousness usually fades as language develops, but the sacred terrain of this precognitive time in our own personal history is often accessed through experiences of illness or physical suffering. However, this is not the only time we can experience this. In the healing symbolized by Chiron, we are invited to touch this mysterious and powerful realm as an ongoing modality of awareness, which supports the arising of individuality not disconnected from its roots, but arising from them. The fixity of our ego structures is sourced here, and our awareness of these primal origins enable us to be in contact with their formidable energy, rather than either fearing it or becoming obsessively driven by it. In this way, we are released. I wanted to add something here. I think it's hard to imagine a future other than the one that we see collapsing all around us right now. But perhaps we are ending our connection with the earthly world to expand to a higher consciousness beyond this plane. Perhaps technology will shift sooner than we think, and we'll move beyond this planet. And even if we remain here, technology may alter our consciousness in a way that is hard for us to envision based on our current experience. All I know is that generation after generation is always fearing the future. And at each stage, we continue to adapt. So all I can see is that this is just a new phase that we're entering into. One can hope. I really learned a lot about this journey from both Melanie Reinhart and Liz Green. I also read an excellent book by Barbara Henclau, whom I quoted in an episode I did about the Chiron return on my Heretic Sisters show, which if you want to check that out, you can find on the Heretic Sisters playlist in my channel. Now, I want to review some charts as it relates to my own, because I think it really informs my experience of my Chiron return. And I also want to demonstrate how you can do this with your own cycles. It really helps you process some of the things that are happening. Now, as you can see, Chiron's discovery chart is on the outer wheel of my natal wheel. My natal wheel is the inner wheel. And as you can see, Chiron's discovery happened about 2 years after I was born. And even though Chiron is now in Taurus, it had just left Aries, and the South Node is still in Aries, which is interesting because the North Node is now in Aries. As you can see in this chart, Chiron is separating from a conjunction to my natal Hygeia, which is directly opposite of my natal Uranus in the first house. Now, my grandfather, my mother's father, had died just the month prior. So he died in October when Chiron was exactly conjunct my natal Hygeia. Natal Hygeia is also has a theme around health. And the Uranus in my chart can also symbolize the grandfather. So it was really symbolic of my grandfather dying at this time. And I'm not sure how my mother experienced his death, but I know it was a complex experience because my grandfather had a big shadow around our family, as my mom had this belief she was breaking the chains of his influence. My grandfather was apparently an abusive alcoholic, and my mother, in response, went to an opposite extreme as a religious fanatic. This is common in generation after generation. If one generation experiences their family in a dysfunctional way, they will often respond by going to the opposite extreme. And we can see this happening in our political environment. You know, when one party institutes changes that the other party doesn't like, they react to an opposite extreme, and it goes back and forth, and it locks us in a cycle until we can ascend it. And that's exactly what is happening in this chart. It's called the law of polarity. And as you can see in this chart, Venus Venus is very important. It's on my ascendant. I am part of the Pluto and Libra generation. Libra is ruled by Venus. And if you know anything about Libra, it's, the symbol is the balance of the scales. But what a lot of people don't understand about that is Libras aren't necessarily balanced. They're basically going from one extreme to the other to find balance. That's the point of Libra. But often we're locked in the extremes. Now, the Pluto and Libra generation has karma around relationships and finding equality and balance in relationships. They can experience family ruptures, which I very much did. My growing up years were very chaotic and divisive. My parents were constantly fighting for control, moving and separating. As you can see with Mars' presence in my third house, Mars is the ruler of my descendant. It squares Chiron, even though it rules it. So, my growing up years was very chaotic. And I felt like I was living in a battlefield, both with my parents, but also in relationship to my siblings. My mom was very idealistic. She wanted a big family. She was brought up around a lot of Mormon influence, and they have a lot of big families. But, my father was working all the time. He was a white collar worker, not a white collar, a blue collar worker. He was in refrigeration. He worked a lot. My mother just was staying at home, and she wasn't very satisfied with her life as a mother. She wanted something more for herself. And I have this distinct memory. It's a vague memory, but it feels like there's a dark cloud around my mother. When we moved to Tucson for my father's job when I was around 4 or 5, my little brother must have been around 1 or 2 during this time. And I had 3 older siblings also. It was during this time that my parents first separated. I, and my younger brother went to live with my grandmother. My mother wanted to go to school to become a nurse, and that was the biggest fight between my parents. My father at the time stayed in Tucson with the 3 older kids until they eventually reunited. This happened again and again throughout my life. I moved across country twice, and my mother got another degree after she became a nurse. She became a doctor. She only spent 1 year as a nurse until my parents finally split for good when I graduated college. Chiron being on my descendant, and my descendant in Aries ruled by Mars, it's like I'm really attracted to, but also wounded by the martial energy. And it's interesting to note that my progressed sun is now in Aries. So I'm really trying to integrate this martial energy into my own identity rather than looking after, trying to get it from somebody else externally from me. And this is very demonstrative of my North Node in the 2nd house, really concentrating on my own resources and becoming my own source of activation, of going after what I want. Okay, let's move on to the Sibley chart. Okay, excuse this rather large divergence into my family history, but I think it's very important to understand my connection to this chart and how my experience is so personal to the wound that's also in the US's chart. Both my parents were from the Deep South. My mom's mother was from a family that had been more well-to-do in the not-so-distant past. My great-grandmother had been a daughter of a Confederate, and they proudly held on to this certificate as a badge of honor. Being part of the Confederate was meaningful to my ancestors. I can imagine that side of the family well off and educated, and they had a complex relationship to slavery. I don't think anybody can really understand this unless they were brought up in this environment. And I think it's interesting to note that I have been brought up in many environments, and so I can understand a little bit more deeply how people are conditioned depending on their environment. My grandmother married a young and hopeful journalism major in college. He grew up in a poorer family, and I don't know much about them, but they were very scrappy in nature and entrepreneurial from what I've heard. My dad referred to them as con men, but I don't know how much that is true. Now, after he married my grandmother, he joined the Air Force, where they traveled the world and settled in Arizona after he retired. So my mother grew up in Arizona. She did not grow up in Georgia. My father, on the other hand, did grow up in Georgia, and he was from a very small mill town near Columbus. His father had separated from his mother, which was very unusual at the time. They had 5 kids together, 4 boys and 1 girl. His mother raised her kids with the money she made working in the local factory until it eventually shut down as the country shifted away from operating factories out of the US. Now, some of his extended family had owned local businesses and had done quite well for some time, but the town had little opportunities for my father, and he escaped, as many young men do, by enlisting in the Army. My parents met on a bus heading to Georgia when my mom was just 17 years old. Their synastry shows their karmic connection, and I have no doubt that that meeting was a fated event. Now, my dad's family grew up in a racist environment. This was seeped into the town's consciousness, as I was to find out when we moved there when I was just 7. Just as an illustration of this, the Y was still segregated, and this was in the mid-'80s. Both my father and mother rejected this about their past, but my mother more so than my father, because she was raised in Arizona, and it was she just wasn't around that environment. And my dad really wasn't conscious of his racism. You know, I witnessed his inoculation from time to time, but, you know, he just really wasn't conscious of it. But thankfully, we were raised in opposition to this. We even belonged to a church with a famous Black pastor in my middle school years. I was instead inoculated differently. I was raised strictly charismatic evangelical. Everyone was going to hell except for the people who believed exactly the way my mother believed. I was conditioned with very distorted beliefs around religion, and it's centered around shame. If you watched the Duggars family documentary that was just recently released, it was sort of like that, with just a different flavor. As any good Aquarian, I rebelled vehemently against this religion in my teenage years. Now, this had something to do with an event that happened to me in my early childhood, which propelled me to repeat a pattern that made it impossible for me to cognitively accept my mother's religion and remain sane. I was the only child in my family to move to New York City. Because of my introduction to many more cultures and belief systems, I eventually became the only liberal in my family. You could say at this time, I was inoculated into the tech world, where material science and logic ruled. All this to say, I'm not surprised that my chart is closely connected to the US chart and the identity politics that we've all been manipulated by in these recent elections. The ideologies that rule various parts of our country are fundamentally about deeply held beliefs that feed into the self-interest groups, and they have grown more and more extreme, and they keep us locked into the same patterns, even though we have parts of the country that are, you know, have grown up in this environment. I think it just keeps us locked in by getting more and more inoculated into this conditioning over and over again, and this division that's played out in front of us. When I was born, the US was going through its 3rd Chiron return. As you can see, I have a lot of connections to USA Sibley chart. Here, the Sibley's Mercury is just minutes away from my own midheaven. And the Mercury here is square Chiron. So there's a lot of tension around the Sibleys and wounding around the US's identity and its racial past. And here you can see Saturn is really close to my natal Pluto, and Juno is right on my ascendant. So it's no wonder I'm feeling this election period very keenly. I remember when Trump was first elected president in 2016. I was in Australia at the time. I had just joined an Australian company who was trying to sell their predictive AI software in the United States municipal government. I had been fiercely involved in that election cycle after splitting with much of my family during the Obama years over gay marriage. It was a huge blow to me at the time and very surreal being out of the country. I remember calling my father, who was a big Fox News fan during this time, and yelling at him for how he raised his sons to be misogynistic. My father had 3 sons and 6 girls, so this male-female power dynamic was also a theme in his life. This was the year before I found out that my father was sick with stage 4 lung cancer. He didn't know he was sick either. I will never forget what my father said at the time. He said, "Don't take politics too seriously. It's just rich men fighting each other." And if you think about that, it's very true. They stoke all of the beliefs that our different parts of the country are still moving through. And they keep us locked into these patterns by stoking it and continuing the propaganda that we've been conditioned by in our own environments. I loved my dad a lot. He did have a lot of misogynistic beliefs embedded in him, but I knew he was just a product of his time. We had grown close as we both aged. He was always my biggest fan, sometimes my closest confidant. When I moved across country to Austin after he died and during my Uranus opposition, I had a chance to heal the fissures within my family. But as luck would have it, my son started to experience his own gender identity crisis. So those fissures or wounds were reignited, and I had to move across country once again, near my birthplace, so I could finish my midlife journey. And funny or ironically, my son has his Saturn at 15 degrees Libra. So it's very connected again to the US Sibley's chart. And the reason why I had to deal with this and had to move away from Austin was because of the legislation was going after families like mine, and we were forced to move. So my son was definitely involved in this and has since re-embraced his identity and has found some healing to his identity. But it's very interesting that that happened when I moved to Austin. This election has been personal to me, and now I have a new understanding and compassion for where we are at as a country, all of us. I grieve for the division and how we are currently incapable of moving past this karmic stain on the US. We keep being played by the politics that keep us stuck in these rigid belief systems so we cannot ascend and create new stories. We are currently reverting once again back to our past. The only things I can hope for is that we will soon be shaken up so vigorously that we hit rock bottom, so there's nowhere to go but up. I want to just quickly review my Chiron return chart to point out a few things. As you can see, there's a lot of energy in Aries, and Mars has just entered Aries, which is interesting because Mars rules my Chiron. The North Node and Mercury is also in Aries. And as I pointed out prior, Mercury is squared the US Sibley's Mercury. So it's the wound of propaganda that's happening, the wound of aggressive words, the wound of aggressive actions, which is very interesting, I think. In my own progress chart, my sun has entered Aries. It's about halfway through Aries now. And with that, I think what's been happening to me is I'm becoming my descendant energy. So instead of looking for action outside of myself, for the martial energy outside of myself, I'm integrating that energy within and coming up with new ways to productively deal with my martial energies. Venus is right next to my natal Hygeia, right across from my natal Uranus. So I'm experiencing a lot of changes in my relationships. I'm experiencing a lot of changes in my career and how I move forward with my Mars energy, and figuring out how to go toward my North Node, which is all about self-reliance, and finding that self-reliance instead of the generational past, which has really been the females prior to me, which really had to rely on their husbands to really make their mark in the world. What I don't think people understand about this past, where women had no rights, is that it was really dependent on who they were married and whether that was going to be a great experience or not. Because like my grandfather was a violent alcoholic. My grandmother had not many choices outside of relying on my grandfather and then relying on her son after my grandfather died. So for me in this generation, it's really relying on my own resources and really finding ways to integrate the martial energy into my own life. Now, I just wanted to talk about this as related to Chiron in Aries in general. And I found something that was really interesting. During 1976, the Gun Owners of America was founded. And I don't know about you, but I didn't know about this Gun Owners of America. I had really only heard about the NRA, and I heard about all of the money that was pumped into the NRA and their lobbying. But the Gun Owners of America is a more extreme group than the NRA. It also lobbies both state and federal legislators to promote the Second Amendment rights. But as we know, the Second Amendment was very different than the way that they interpret it today. It was about the, being able to have a self-regulated militia. And the Second Amendment was written during the time when there wasn't all of these advanced technology that has given us, the war killing machines, the really dangerous, guns that we have today. And it's gotten to the point where, this Gun Owners of America, it says it's the no compromise gun lobby. So they take a very extreme stance on gun ownership, and they will not compromise, which is very, Mars, Chiron and Aries sort of actions, where there's no compromise. You don't compromise, you just stand to your extreme position. And in that, we have a lot of mass shootings as a result, because anybody can get access to these machine guns, which, have no real use in for the average person to own. But since there are no compromises, there are no regulations. Now, the people that are the cause of these mass shootings, they're symptoms of a larger problem that also is related to Chiron and Aries, I would posit. A lot of men in our society are called sissies if they show any type of emotion. So, a lot of men, and those are the majority of our mass shootings are men, they really have no ways to deal with emotions that arise, except for in anger, except for to lash out. So it's no surprise that a lot of our mental illness is around this, going after violence to solve their anger problems and what they're frustrated about. And they have access to these killing machines. And so, year after year, we are traumatized by these machine guns. It's rather a shame. Also, it's very important to understand that a lot of the great movements have come during a Chiron and Aries time period. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the end of apartheid, women getting the right to vote, the signing of the Declaration of the Independence, the end of the Vietnam War and World War I, all happened during Chiron and Aries. So a lot of fighting for our rights, and probably in response to all of the things that are happening today, losing our rights, that comes in great struggle when you really need to or have no choice but to fight for your rights. And then, in the 60s and early 70s, there was a time of powerful social change and unrest that's being again resurfaced today. Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King were both assassinated during this time. And that event of these assassinations, this wound of violence, this suffering it engendered, and marked a new chapter in the 1960s. And it also revealed a knot in the fabric of humanity that we're still working to undo. The knot of racism, oppression, and brutality, which are being stoked once again. And it's interesting to note that that between 1918 and 1927 was the end of World War I and the rise of Hitler. The publication of Mein Kampf was 1925. And that's probably why, a lot of the reasons why Hitler is being brought up again. Some people argue that you shouldn't be calling Trump Hitler because he's nowhere close to Hitler. But some of the strategy that's being used today is reminiscent of Hitler because of all the propaganda and the conditioning that's going out, the misinformation that's going out that really did impact people's voting. Is very reminiscent of this. And then also a lot of the genocide is very similar to what Hitler did, even though it's framed differently sometimes. It's very ironic that we're not coming to terms with what's going on in our world. We're blaming each other for it, but it's very symbolic to what happened in previous time periods. And it's interesting to note that it wasn't until Chiron entered Taurus that the Great Depression started, but the factors leading into it were in the making. The positives of Chiron and Aries is it brings about world change, innovation. During this time period, Microsoft and Apple computers, videotapes, and the first man to walk on the moon. It was all in Chiron and Aries time period, very reminiscent of what, is happening today with the launch of AI. So Chiron and Aries were encouraged to think outside the box. We've always lived in a certain way, so why don't we try something new? And then again, maybe that's, what I would hope to have happened. The hope that I have with the Trump administration is all of these shakeups will eventually lead to something that is, approaching things in a brand new way. Now, it might be that we have to live in chaos for a long time before we get there, but that's the thing that I hold hope for. And, to talk about it a little bit more, about the themes that are going on and what you should really think about is with Chiron and Aries, the knot runs around our ability to take action, to stand up for ourselves, to bravely move forward. Chiron and Aries invokes the previous times when we were scarred by aggression, violence, or even war. It touches on suppressed anger and frustration, as well as defeatism. It's power struggles in relationships. It's our physical wounds, our handicaps, the times we felt stuck, Chiron in Aries is the karma of inaction. And I will say all of this is very familiar to what I've been experiencing. I've had a huge transition in my career. I'm still working through, and that's felt very. I felt very powerless in that, and sometimes paralyzed about how to move forward. And I remember this happening also the last time that Chiron was in Aries. I was trying to figure out how to move forward. I had gotten my MFA and I was stuck in this nowhere job and trying to find my way out of it, which I eventually did, but it took me a really long time. And now, I've been struggling in relationship, and then this political environment, really has hit me. And for a moment, I was just like, well, what is this all for? Why do we even try? If this is the dominant culture that's going to rule the world. But really, I can't get stuck there, because that's the issue with Chiron and Aries, when you get stuck. So it's been a great review time for me. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with human design, and I haven't brought it into these analysis, but I wanted to today. In previous episodes, I was experimenting with a different way that the I Ching was layered over the astrology. And so human design lays over basically I Ching over astrology, and then it adds in the chakra systems and the tree of life. This is what it's all about. But I just wanted to take a look at this so you could see how interesting it is as it relates to the themes that are going on in my life. I have these two channels that I don't normally have in my human design profile. And when you have channels that are connected, it's really a personal experience that you're going through, and it really impacts you in many ways. And as you see here, Venus is here connecting my Uranus in the gate 28. And the gate 28 is about taking risks, and the gate 38 is about struggle. So it's all about what risks do you want to take and struggle with for a higher purpose. And this gate of struggle is my weak point, basically. And it's very prominent in my life. And it's really what I've been, really, again, another symbol of what I've been going through. And then here is, I have my design Uranus in gate 50. And if you see the other part of Uranus, my personality Uranus is in this gate of nurturing, and it's about self-sufficiency. So, there's this change around how can I become interdependent with my relationships? How can I rely on my own resources? And how can I participate with enlightened self-interest? Now, I went to a relationship retreat right before this episode, and it talked about enlightened self-interest as it relates to your partners, and how it's much more to your benefit to treat your partners in a way that is beneficial to you. So it's an interesting take on enlightened self-interest, and how we treat others will really impact how we are treated by others. And then, Saturn is highlighted here because it is conjunct my design Jupiter in the gate of community, and also Venus up here in the channel of logic. And it's about nostalgia. It's about memories of the past. It's about memories of my family. And Chiron itself, it's not connected here, but my Chiron, my personality Chiron, sits in this gate 42, and it connects this gate that I have natally, which is my designs Saturn, which is about starting new things. And it's not only, it's connected here because it's about not only starting new things, but can I complete the things that I started? So there's some wounding around that, because oftentimes this is Chiron is in the gate 42.1, so it's diversifying. Sometimes I start a lot of new things and then I abort when I get overwhelmed. And this, is related to my sacral. In my design, I'm a projector, and so I don't have consistent use of my own resources, and so that's a wound there as well. So that's interesting to think about, and also in relationships to my thoughts around relationships. In my design, Chiron sits in the gate of shock. And what I've been really experiencing during this election, I didn't actually, at one hand, I really expected Trump to win, but on the other hand, I didn't. I was hoping that he wouldn't win, because I didn't want to go through what I had gone through during 2016, this chaotic time. But I am, and I have to deal with it in a new way, which I'm trying to do. So that, and I just wanted to end to talk about these books and the Chiron connections to these books. Now, right around the time that I was investigating this story and collecting information about Melanie's book for this presentation, I discovered this book that was written only 2 years before this book came out, and it's called The Chalice and the Blade. And it talks about our history, and it talks about how there's other interpretations of our matriarchal past, and it's about our past before this age of dominance and violence. Chiron and Aries, came about. They call it the patriarchy. We have some evidence that we lived in a more matriarchal time. And what she talks about, which I haven't really read the whole thing, but this book is a framework for studying social systems with particular attention to how society constructs roles and relations between the female and male halves of society. And it's about collaboration and partnership, where neither side is dominant over the other, but each side has its own distinct strengths and is respected. It's that interdependence that I was talking about. And so it's interesting that these were both written in the 80s, and yet now we're still here cycling back. And it's interesting also to note that The Chalice and the Blade was written when Chiron was in Gemini. So as you can see, Gemini is a double-bodied sign, and so male-female, and really re-examining the roles of male-female. And again, Chiron and the Healing Journey, which I quoted from, Melanie Reinhardt wrote this when Chiron was in Cancer. And it's interesting to note that when Chiron was in Cancer, Uranus was directly opposite in Capricorn. And then I didn't quote Barbara Hand Clow's book, but her book was published in 1993. And that was the year I graduated from high school. And Chiron was in Leo at the time, at 20 degrees Leo. And it was opposing at the time Saturn at 21 Aquarius. So it's interesting that both of those time periods were both opposing they were both in the lights, in different lights, and they were both opposing, what Chiron it orbits between. And my sun is at 21 or 22 Aquarius. So Saturn was right next to my sun. So that is very interesting. Anyway, that is the end of my presentation. I hope you got something out of it. It was quite long, but I just wanted to say thank you again for giving these videos some love. I'll have one more video after this to really sum up my experience. And I invite you to sign up for my newsletter. I've been experimenting with horary charts. I think I have some interesting content to present after this is done. And also, please don't forget to check out my solar return special if that is of interest. I'd love to do a solar reading for you. So goodbye. I hope you enjoy the rest, or, you find your way through the rest of this time period in a way that can allow you to ascend it and to focus on what you can control in your environment and how to move things forward in your own way without getting wrapped up in the polarities that are happening in the external world. So thank you. Have a great day.